Good morning. I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming out on this absolutely beautiful Sunday. It is my real pleasure to be here for this discussion with Litt Woon and Katherine May. Our subject this morning, within the larger theme of care for this weekend at Bibliotopia, is back to life, nature and the art of repairing ourselves. I'd like to briefly introduce our two guests before we get started. Litt Woon is a Malaysian and Norwegian writer and anthropologist and certified mushroom expert who lives in Norway and has since university. Following the death of her husband, she wrote her first work of nonfiction, The Way Through the Woods, Overcoming Grief Through Nature. The English version was translated by Barbara Haveland, and the French, which is also upstairs, La Femme et les Champignons, was translated by Alex Fouillet. The book is a guide to the fascinating world of mycology, as well as a meditation on a pathway through grief. And please, this is Katherine May, a British author and podcaster, author of both fiction and nonfiction, including The Electricity of Every Living Thing, which I believe is your most recent.
No, that's my previous
one, okay. Yeah. And the Whitstable High Tide Swimming Club. She was also the editor of The Best Most Awful Job, an anthology of essays on motherhood. Today we are going to focus on her hybrid memoir, Wintering, which describes the benefits of the fallow period at difficult times before re-emerging into life. The French title is Hiverner, translated by Véronique Minder. She also hosts the marvelous podcast, which we'll maybe talk about a little bit, called the Winterings Sessions. So please join me in welcoming these two today. Thank you both for being here. As an avid reader of both fiction and nonfiction about the natural world, I was delighted to read your books at the same time and have them start having a conversation in my mind. One of my very first connections between the books, and which I think serves as a good introduction, is that you both experienced a very sudden rupture in normal life and had to confront one of those profound questions of mortality and the fragility of human life. From this, you both embarked on journeys that you describe in your two books. So, Woon, could you describe for us discovering your love for mushrooms, hunting for mycology, placed you on a path that shifted you out of your grief?
Thank you. Well, mushrooms was, in a way, accidental. And so following my husband's death, I was, like many other people, in my bereavement group. You know, everyone was searching for some kind of comfort. And we all tried different things, me too, you know, yoga, meditation, you know, whatever. Yeah. And so it was accidental that I stumbled upon mushrooms and through this course, you know, beginner's course. However, what was special about it was when I was in the woods and foraging for mushrooms and found my first edible mushroom that I could identify on my own, yeah. It gave me such pleasure, and pleasure which I didn't think I would ever have again. That in this space of darkness, that was the light, you know, and it certainly just showed me that there might be a way. Yeah. I didn't know, but that there might be a way out of this darkness. So.
We'll talk about it again later, but it's one of the things you describe so beautifully in the book is the sort of shutdown of the senses and how through this process of walking and listening and looking and smelling, you were able to start feeling again. So it's really lovely. And Katherine May, can you please tell us a little bit about the first fallow experience that you had? Although not the first, I would say the first yeah. that sent you off into this project and how it sort of sparked you to contemplate what this meant.
Yeah, so the book opens with my husband very dramatically suddenly getting an appendicitis, which it was just a really severe one. And it really kicked off this process of what I call like falling through the cracks. So there was this time when he was in hospital when we were kind of hovering between two worlds. We weren't part of the everyday world anymore. And I tried to describe the moment when we felt like the rest of life was happening through glass. And I think that is so common for those experiences, that we feel like the rest of the world is carrying on without us. And we are in this unique, isolated place. And of course, it's not actually unique. It's just that we're all doing it in different bubbles of isolation over loads of different things. But at that point, when my husband got ill, I just handed in my notice for my job. I'd been in a busy academic role, and I'd got to the point where I realised it just wasn't sustainable. I was exhausted. And I didn't know what was coming next. I didn't know how we were going to survive. And then I got sick too. So there was this whole kind of row of dominoes that fell and cast us out into a winter for a while.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting about both of what you've just said is that I love the phrase in the book, the gaps, I want to quote it correctly, gaps in the mesh of the everyday world. And it's true, there's this idea that everything hums along perfectly, normally, and then these experiences happen that in fact show us that that is not the case. And yet, both of these experiences, all of the experiences that we had, are things that every human will at some point experience.
Yes. And so these gaps that one falls into, this is like, they are actually gaps that are part of life, which is what you are saying, right? But when we are in those gaps, in those dark spots, and life is carrying on up there, why is that so? That's because people don't look at the gaps and don't know how to deal with the gaps. And when you are in a gap, you are, in an abnormal space. But actually, these are normal spaces, and it's taken us time to sort of maybe just to integrate these gaps too in the whole of life, right? And life is both gaps and non-gaps.
I think you've just segued to the most perfect introduction of what Wintering tries to do. This idea that these are periods in our life that will happen, that do happen, and it's our approach to them that changes. Could you sort of define Wintering for us?
I think you've just done it really well. So wintering is a season in the cold, a metaphorical season in the cold. So it's a time when, for whatever reason, you feel as though you have stepped outside the normal congress of everyday life. And I mean, grief is such an excellent example of that, because it's so normal. I mean, it's one of the few inevitabilities of this life that the people that we love will die. And yet, somehow, our grievers are left in isolation and feeling like they have to almost make it up for themselves, and work out. We don't have, or certainly in sort of mainstream Western Christian culture, we don't have a roadmap for grief in the same way that perhaps Jewish cultures have got. I mean, that's a great example of how we can support winters a little bit better. But however we find ourselves in this time, my point is not that this is like a magical moment when everything's actually great and we just don't realise it. It's terrible. It's a vile, unpleasant time. It's brutal. It's hard. But that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't engage with it, because actually it's how wisdom is built. Wisdom isn't built through nice things. It's built through terrible things. But I also wanted to make the point in the book that we can find a kind of unity through it that we don't realise we have, which is why we can sit here on a stage together and talk about completely different experiences, but absolutely know the same things.
Yeah, and there's an element of, which is articulated extremely well in The Way Through the Woods, but that there's two journeys happening at the same time. There's the inner journey and the outer journey, and they may or may not touch, but they are happening simultaneously. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so my inner journey was this journey through this, for me, unknown landscape of grief. And the outer journey was, my discovery of this world of fungi that pushed me along, and slowly, mushroom by mushroom.
I was going to say spore by spore.
Yes, spore by spore.
Mushroom is
Okay.
a little more elegant.
And for me, it was connected, definitely in my head. But when I was writing the book, I sort of at first didn't allow myself to connect the dots, because how does one write the book about mushrooms and mourning?
Yeah.
So that took me a while. So it started as a book about a very personal, quirky book about my discovery of this kingdom of fungi. Oh, I forget your question again.
No, that's okay. That's all right. It was just to talk about the inner and outer journey.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So they were connected.
Yeah. But it's also this idea of, I want to say sort of information, which is something, Katherine, that you talk about in the sense that you take us through several different kinds of winterings. And in each one, there's almost a different scientific or sociological or historical or cultural element to them. And it does run that same parallel of sort of outer journey. I mean, learning to go cold swimming, learning to go and see the northern lights. All of the different things that you used, I think, as different metaphors, do a very similar thing. Yeah. Would you put it in that words, or?
What strikes me just amid this conversation really is that one of the ways to cope with a wintering, to cope with a time out of life, is to find a chosen pocket that's outside of normal life as well.
Yeah.
And that seems to be, a really common theme for people that endure these times, is that they find a way to enter a state of flow. They find a way to take their, like a contemplative space really for themselves, and to make time to process it in a way that engages their bodies rather than their obsessive rolling minds.
Yeah. I love that you used the word flow, because you used the word
mushroom
mushroom flow.
Yeah.
and this idea of slowing down almost to a point, like a philosophical approach to life. You talk a lot about how our lives have become saturated. And so can wintering, in the way that you describe it, can that be a response for us in some way?
Yeah, I think it can almost be a chosen response as well as a sort of passive event, because actually if we can find ways to enter into these more contemplative states in everyday life, then we're building a toolkit for the rest of life. And so, yeah, I write about cold swimming, I write about walking, which I love doing in winter particularly, and, various other ways of getting out of my head and into my body. And the cold swimming is the one that everybody picks up on, because actually I think in lots of ways it's quite extreme, but it's also the best shortcut I know to leave my head for a while and to just exist, because you're so engaged with the business of surviving. You have to be constantly listening to the feedback of your body while you're in very cold water. And it's an enormous relief. It's a relief to put your head somewhere else for a while.
How long did it take you to get comfortable, if that's the right word I can use, with that kind of cold swimming?
It was surprising, actually, because I was all ready to to work through it gradually. And the first time I got in, I was in for 30 seconds and I ran out screaming. I was really thinking like, this is surely going to kill me. But then after that, I stood on the beach, and because that was my first swim was like in February, and there was a tiny bit of snow on the beach. It was really cold. The water would have been about 3 degrees. Little yelps from the audience.
Yes. Yeah.
But it was the moment after I got out, actually, that I thought, oh, actually, that was okay. It didn't kill me. And I immediately wanted to go back in. And it really surprised me how over the next 2 weeks I swam every day, and how quickly I was able to spend quite a long time in the water. I mean, 10 minutes, not hours. Because I don't swim when I get in cold water. I just sort of tread water and be there for a while. But it had this addictive quality, and actually my body was okay receiving it. It was safe as long as I paid attention, and that was the important thing, that I had to be present for a little while.
You mention this marvelous, you tell an anecdote in the book about someone who really uses going into cold swimming as a form of therapy, as a form of shutting down, I think, all sorts of external stimuli. And that really struck me as something that we don't encounter. It's interesting, like the idea of you shutting down all the external stimuli, and at the same time, your experience was opening up into all of these external stimuli. I would love to hear you talk about those walks a little bit.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. I can relate to what you were saying, Catherine, because like you mentioned before, so when my husband died, I felt like all my senses just shut down. My feelings just shut down. Yes, I was sad, but like I didn't know what was happening with me. Yeah. And being in the woods and looking for mushrooms sort of slowly opened up, all these different senses one by one. And I write a lot about smell because that was so difficult for me. Okay. But there was a way of like awakening my body again, and being aware and sensitive of new things to smell, new ways of seeing, and so I became, in a way, I suppose, a new person, and that was what was needed of me because when you lose someone, or when you lose anything, because it's a book about loss. So when you lose something that's so integral to your identity, you need to sort of find a way of, finding a new identity. So being open in your senses to new perspectives, new stimuli, that makes for a new self.
I think it's very interesting too. You've said that it was sort of pure serendipity that brought you into this beginner's class on mushrooms, but I find the way that you describe mushrooms and the life, or I should say, you'll do a better description than me, but the sort of interconnected and very reliant network of mushroom to forest and all of that, it is in some sense reminiscent of a close relationship, of a marriage, of a friendship. And I was very moved by that. Is it something that you realized later through the writing of the book? Or were you even aware of that perhaps when you were embarking on the mushroom journey?
I was not aware of anything when I was embarking on this journey. So of course, the fact, the process of writing sort of forces you in a way to make sense of something that was meaningless. Yeah. So that was an important part of this healing process, definitely, the whole writing process. Yeah.
It's a very lovely and delicate connection in the book, which I think comes out as you share your love of the mushrooms and the different things that you learn. Is it correct that someone who is afraid of mushrooms is a mycophobe?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that's really
But if you love the mushrooms, they will love you back,
They will show up only for you in your specific place in the forest.
That's true. Once you,
I think it is. I do think
it gets called mushroom consciousness, doesn't it, in mushroom circles?
Maybe there's some more interconnectedness.
Then we know, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Catherine, I'm going to go back to your book just briefly. We were talking just before about how your book came out right before a pandemic. It sort of enveloped the world, and people went into, I think, what we could call a very large wintering. And I'm curious how people have responded to the book in that context.
Yeah, so in the UK, Wintering came out, I think, 3 weeks before our first lockdown. And in fact, I know at the launch party, we were talking about the possibility of this pandemic arising. And there was so much, that's all anyone could talk about, that we'd heard all these rumors and surely it couldn't possibly be true. And so I had, a couple of weeks when people were talking about Wintering as a book about things that happened in life. And then ever since then, it became, the phrase mass wintering entered the language pretty quickly. Yeah. And by the time it came out in America the following November, people thought that it was written during the pandemic about the pandemic. And it was tricky for me in lots of ways, because actually I felt like I was carrying quite a lot for people. But yeah, maybe we needed a way to talk about what we were all going through, because I think what was fascinating about pandemic winterings is that it wasn't actually a mass wintering, in that people weren't enduring the same winter at the same time. There was, you know, there were people who'd been sick, there were people who were recovering from illness, there were people who had long-term illnesses and so were dealing with the absolute terror of catching COVID. There were people who felt very lonely. There were people who felt like there were too many people in their house at once. There were people who were separated, you know, that they were all different. And what fascinated me to watch it online, like you, I love watching people and what they do, is how often that led to conflict. You know, that people, rather than saying, oh, we're both suffering, said, no, yours is much easier than mine to deal with, because you may be, you know, you may have your kids at home, but lucky you, because, you know, it became angry really quickly, which is what we so often do. And it kind of encapsulates for me the learning that we have to do about these moments, to just acknowledge each other's suffering, to just be able to look at each other's suffering and accept it without somehow measuring it or feeling like we have to judge it. And you know, like the pandemic seems to have divided us even further somehow, when it could really have united us. And that's, I think, partly because we are unskilled in the language of human endurance and human suffering. And yeah.
Well, and this thought that you really come back to in the book, that life must always sort of occur at this incredibly rapid pace. And no one is allowed to slow down. And so there's so much in Wintering that is a reminder, in fact, to take a moment to slow down. That's what we were talking about before, like a philosophy of, you know, we don't need to be living life at this rapid clip. So it is interesting, we sort of, I hope, or that the world has learned some small mini lessons from the pandemic. I know there was a lot of discussion in various circles about how nice it was that people were not doing anything in some sense. I mean, I know the introverts of the world really rejoiced.
They were rejoicing, yeah. I was pretty in my comfort zone.
Yeah, but I think so that, you know, during the pandemic, that a lot of people discovered the joy of working from home, you know. Yeah. So that has definitely changed, I think, and we'll be carrying that with us going forward. So I think there have been collective lessons too.
Yeah, and I'm seeing lots of people moving to different towns, moving to different countries, retraining to do a different job, leaving jobs, you know, cutting down. I mean, actually, I've noticed a lot of people cutting down to shorter hours, shorter working weeks. So there's all kinds of change that's happening, and I'm fascinated by that. What I'm slightly disappointed by, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, and whether this is true in Norway, but is how little conversation we're having about grief in the aftermath. Or not, it's not even the aftermath, let's face it. I mean, we've still got about 200 people a day dying in the UK.
The sort of downward slope.
Yeah, hopefully, touching wood as I say that. But I'm disappointed in a way that we haven't found a way into talking about mourning and grief, and that actually the deaths have often gone unmemorialised within our countries, except in the most kind of basic terms. I was a little bit hopeful that this might be the moment we finally began to think about how we approach this going into the future, because it's needed.
Well, in the US, 1 million people have died. So definitely it is something that needs to be processed. Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure, like you, whether we have taken this moment to have a better conversation about grief, because I felt definitely personally in my little spot there that grief was something, and grieving, mourning was something I had to take for myself, because it was not given to me. Yeah. There was no space for it, and I described it as a luxury. Yeah. No one wanted to give me, And speaking to what we talked about earlier, in Malaysia, where I come from, right, where as a child, I knew, of course, that, okay, when someone dies, you know, after 7 days, you go and visit them. After 14 days, you go and visit them. After 21 days, you go and visit them. The 7 is, you know, the number here. Yeah. I didn't think very much of it then. But when I was in the midst of my own grief, I finally understood, you know, the function of this, which is that society gives you space and acknowledges your grief. And so you don't have to carry it and talk about it or force people to talk about it, because they come to you and they know this is happening. Yeah. So that is actually what I wish we could have here.
Well, we're in need of those patterns that we can fall into at vulnerable moments. Like, it's the wrong time to be making your own pattern, isn't it?
Yes,
you.
It's very nice if the structure exists already. That was it was such a unique part of your book, in the sense of coming from Malaysia, from Chinese community in Malaysia, experiencing this event in Norway, in a culture that's not your own, and how difficult that actually was. I think it speaks to it speaks to the idea of ritual, as you just said, and there's some. We'll talk about it in a minute, but the idea of a ritual to mark your winterings.
But also, I mean, I think there's a new diagnostic label of pathological grief. Have you come across this?
Yes.
Which is grief that lasts over a year.
Wow.
And I don't think we should be pathologizing grief just because it lasts over a year. Like, it's normal and healthy to grieve for the rest of your life when you've lost someone important. And I mean, I'm sure that there are other elements that could be pathological and would need help and support, but actually I think that points us to the lack of acknowledgement that
exactly.
people in crisis.
Yes, no, I've read about, and I didn't like it when I read it.
I mean, they have to exist for American insurers, essentially. I mean, that's why these things come about. They have to be fundable in a fixed system, but it creates the impression that your grief has a time limit.
Exactly.
And I know that I still grieve for my grandmother, who I lost when I was 17. You know, that's a very long time ago now, I hate to admit, but yeah.
No, but you know, there's acute grief where grief paralyzes you, and it's 24/7 and you cannot do anything else. And there's grief where you have found a little space for it.
Yeah.
You know, and you can live, you know, your daily life without it, you know, coming up at every minute, you know. So yeah.
But there is some sense in the help of the ritual. And I would love to hear, Katherine, you talk about one of the things that you discuss in the book is actually you did some research into Druidism.
Yes.
And I found this fascinating. And you yourself say that it's maybe part invented, part taken from old traditions. But this idea of marking a dark period with a certain rhythm of events, what did you discover in that?
Yeah, so I went to Stonehenge for their winter solstice celebration, which is, there's 2 times of year when you can actually go up to the stones, and that's the winter solstice and the summer solstice. And it's been offered by Stonehenge as an acknowledgement that lots of different groups find spiritual meaning in the stones. And after I went, I wanted to make sense of the experience, really, because it was actually really beautiful in that loads of people crowded into that space, but they didn't have a common purpose. But they existed very happily together all the same. And so I decided I wanted to interview Britain's chief druid. But it turned out, so I'm going to tell you this anecdote because it's fascinating. It's an amazing job title. 2 people claim it.
Oh.
Yeah. So there is one guy who claims that he is the descendant of Arthur Pendragon, and that he is the heir to Camelot. I didn't interview him. He seems to spend most of his time on Facebook arguing with people. But there's another very wise soul called, he was Philip Carr-Gomm. The new chief druid is actually a woman, very excitingly. And I got into a conversation with him that I didn't expect, which was about why he has adopted this pagan wheel of the year that divides the year between the solstices, the equinoxes, and the points in between. And it turned into this surprisingly emotional conversation, really, which was not that we believe that this has magical meaning somehow, but instead that there's like this practical sense in which having a set ritual that you're going to perform every 6 weeks helps you through really tough times. And he said that he'd recently got divorced and that actually he'd realised more than ever what that meant to him to know when he was in the depths of despair and, his children had moved out and he was, feeling absolutely miserable, to know that he had a gathering to look forward to in a few weeks' time. But that also that gathering would invite him to make whatever meaning came to him at the time. It wasn't going to hand him meaning in a fixed fashion. It was going to invite him to make meaning at that point in time. And that lit a little candle in my head, really, about what ritual is, because I'd grown up outside of any religious practice. I'd been to church and it had seemed like very distant to me and it never made sense to me. But this kind of made sense, that he said, it's weird, and I know it's weird, but sometimes weird things are really good for us. And they kind of are, aren't they?
But
Ritual is weird.
It's that play of dark and light, which I think is an interesting, when we think about the fallow times, the dark times, we think about grief and the way things shut down, that there is a response, even if it's a programmed response through ritual or through some. One of the things you mentioned in the book was that people seemed afraid to talk to you about what had just happened, to even acknowledge that you had suffered this great loss. And I found a really interesting parallel between that and people who also didn't want to talk to you about mushroom hunting, because mushrooms are dangerous and you can't. And I thought this was, it seems to me to be related again to this fear of death.
Well, yeah, many people do, connect mushrooms to death.
Yeah.
And your observation is interesting, because I think what lies beneath this reluctance is knowledge, actually, and a way to talk about it. And rituals are definitely a way to acknowledge and to talk about it, and a sort of a roadmap, in a way, for you out of this difficult space, right? So it's not of course you can have private rituals, but having this kind, ready-made rituals are so much easier and better.
Sure,
yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also, I think what's interesting is they point to a circular understanding of time quite often, where everything cycles back round again. And that's much more hopeful than linear time, which is just a process of loss always. It's always going to be about entropy and things breaking down and things going.
Yeah, either circular or it's a way of integrating.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This experience in the larger experience of life.
Okay, I'm going to switch tacks a tiny little bit, because I know that you are an anthropologist, and one of the things that really struck me about the book was how not only are you going through this way of mushrooms and into the forest, but you are observing mushroom gatherers at the same time. And can you tell us some of the things you observed about this community of people that was alien to you at the time? And as someone who had already moved into one culture, probably with a keen observant eye, what was it like to then move into a second sort of subculture?
Of course, I thought they were weird, in the beginning. Of course, and in the book I describe how I make this journey and become one of the weird ones myself,
Yes.
right? Yes. I'm an anthropologist and I cannot help it. That's the big tool in my tool bag. So I use it not only when I'm observing something outside of me, but I did it also when I was observing this chaos inside of me. And I write about that in the book. But yes, I met all these mushroom people, and at first I thought they were very charming because they were so democratic, in the sense that, you had old people, young people, thin people, fat people, whatever, from all walks of life, right? And they were just united with this one common interest, right? And only later did I discover that this is a very hierarchical society, not in the ways that we normally think, and it was knowledge, right? So the one with the most mushroom knowledge, right, was right on the top, the one who knew all the Latin names to each mushroom and all that. And yes, it was fascinating to see that this was not just in Norway, but I managed to mushroom in other countries, and I discovered that, oh, this is an international group, so the mushroom people, all over the world, they have their secret spots, and if you are a good friend, they might show you that spot, and that is a sign of friendship. Yes.
When I first moved to Switzerland, this is almost 20 years ago, I lived on a farm for a long time, and I would often go into the forest. And one day I was in the forest, and I realized there was a man. This was very frightening at the time, but there was a man standing behind a tree. And he didn't move, and he wouldn't move. And I think he thought I couldn't see him. He was definitely hiding from me because I had clearly stumbled somewhere near his spot.
Yes.
And I would see him later walking around, and then I knew he had his bag and he had his little knife.
So in the woods where I walk my dog, in the autumn, I regularly see a Chinese woman and her son, and they're obviously hunting mushrooms. She always has a big carrier bag full of something. But yeah, the same thing, whenever I see it, they get up and they look all shifty. And they're like, hello, how are you? And you're like, oh, I wonder what you've got there.
They're very reticent in the forest. I think it's a sign that they're on a mission and you should not get involved.
But she's quite near my secret sep spot, so I don't know. She hasn't found my sep.
She hasn't found yours, which is good.
We're both looking a bit shifty at each other.
But it's interesting, you were talking about the hierarchy of knowledge, and I think this relates, in fact, to both of the books, in the sense that I may be taking this a little bit too far, but the fact that, the most knowledgeable person among a group of mushroom is going to be able to tell you if you can eat this thing that may or may not kill you. And I don't want to sound like a mycophobe, because I'm not. I'm a microphobe.
Yeah, I am.
But in that sense, it's a huge power. Yes. In one sense, it goes along with surgeons and people who actually have a considerable amount of control. And if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit, there's a marvelous chapter in the book talking about hallucinogenic mushrooms. And the lack of knowledge that is sometimes freely distributed about these mushrooms. Can you talk about your discoveries of this? Were very anthropological, or your research into them.
Yes, this was because for me, these magic mushrooms were, just another mushroom, and I discovered that, the Mushroom Society in Norway, which I was part of, I couldn't get somebody to tell me about it because they were so afraid of sharing this knowledge. So I thought it was very strange that this society that has in one of its statutes, that to spread knowledge about mushrooms, was so reluctant to talk about this. So I was very provoked, and I said, actually you should change these statutes and say that we will freely share knowledge of all mushrooms except one. And they didn't like that when I said that. But anyway, I through hard work, I managed to find 1, 2, 3 people to interview to tell me more about these magic mushrooms, And yes, so I go very systematically through.
But again, it's interesting because it is, it's connected to fear. It's this thing we don't want to know. Some people are initiated and will hold that knowledge, and other people are afraid of it. So your responses were interesting and quite funny at times. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to ask Katherine, actually. Okay, I'm going to ask Katherine to talk. Sorry, I'm jumping tracks again. But Katherine, I'd like to ask you write so beautifully about everything that is going on during the apparent fallow times. And I'm glad you said earlier that these are not meant to be moments of, okay, this is a horrible time, but I'm going to find everything to appreciate about it. Yeah. But in fact, it's more that this isn't a dead time necessarily. It's the opposite of a dead time, even if those things might be quite painful, the things you're learning or experiencing or doing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually, fallow periods are really busy times, but in a very different way. They're often not economically productive. They often don't involve going out into the world very often. So the productivity of those times is really invisible. But they're actually a kind of a moment for very, very important work to do. And it's often work that we've neglected during the good times. So it's often small things like setting the house straight, setting like your records straight, your papers, getting everything in order. And then there's really big emotional work going on. And I think I've learnt to understand Winterings as times of identity in flux, really. They're moments when who you thought you were has been thrown up in the air, and your job is to remake that identity. And often that involves changes that people never thought that they could make before. And often, interestingly to me, I think often Winterings come about when we're resisting a change that we need to make that's coming to us either way, you know. So it's often true of illness, you know. If we've developed a long-term condition that might be life-threatening, just might be something that's going to affect us for a long time, we often don't accept the changes that demands of us until we're forced into it. And I think that's often what comes there. So it's deeply important, it's deeply vital and important work. That doesn't make it fun, but it's a mixed experience as well, because there are luminous moments within this, and there are moments of great insight. There's a really great metaphor for it that didn't fit in the book, that's too summary, but I never realised until later in life what happens to a butterfly when they go into a pupa, caterpillar when they go into a pupa. I don't know if you all know this as well, but inside that pupa, it's not like the caterpillar growing wings. No. The caterpillar turns itself into soup, into like DNA soup. And within this liquid, it literally liquefies itself, are these cells called imaginal cells, because the imago is the emergent butterfly. And they cluster together, they find each other and remake the butterfly. And I think that is such a perfect metaphor for those fallow periods. We're not transforming in the sense that, you know, a transformer robot transforms. We're soup, you know. We are absolute soup, and we're waiting to completely reimagine what comes out next.
And it's lovely too what you say, because it is an isolated process.
Yeah.
And in the sense that I think that is sometimes where a lot of the resistance comes from, is that it is work you have to do on your own. Now, with perhaps support networks.
Maybe with a therapist as well, you know, maybe with medical assistance. I mean, it's not completely solitary, but there's work there that only you can do and that nobody else can do for you, and nobody can tell you the answers. There's no book you can read, because like quite often when I get interviewed by American radio DJs who've got 10 minutes to interview me, they haven't read the book, fair enough, but they'll say, so, Katherine May, we haven't got long, what's your top 10 tips for wintering? And it's like, there are none, there's nothing, I'm so sorry, I cannot give you that. Like, it's a process that only you can walk through. It's not very American, that.
We are not in America. I would love to ask you to talk a little bit about your podcast. I'm assuming that it came out of Wintering.
Yes.
Was it something you had, so as I mentioned before, Katherine hosts a podcast called the Wintering Sessions. I don't know how often your schedule is, but you're already into season...
2 weeks, yeah.
Season 3?
Season 3, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so the Wintering Sessions was a lockdown project, really. It came, I think I started it in July 2020 or June 2020. And it came from that sense of isolation and what do we do next? I mean, we were talking yesterday about how for writers, everything fell through the floor, really. And I realised that what I was missing most of all were the kind of conversations we're having now, like those intense, nourishing, creative conversations where ideas are exchanged. And that, for me, without those, I found it very hard to write, because I needed that kind of rehearsal of thought that happens. So I decided that I'd start a podcast, as many people did at that time. But luckily it's endured. It's got a really great listenership now. And I invite people to talk about a fallow period in their life and to just really ramble around what they're thinking about right now. It's often the conversations now talk about how we should go back into the world, like what we're bringing from the pandemic time into the next life, whatever that is. And I love having that space to talk about that. It's really, yeah.
It's a lovely celebration of this idea of approaching slowly, of taking time, using the senses, and working through the fallow periods and whatever shape they may be.
But what surprised me and really pleased me is that actually people aren't maudlin when they talk about those times. There's often so much humour, and I honestly think that we've missed that quite often in our culture, that the way that light and darkness sit together, they're totally woven and connected, and that always comes out. And every now and then someone will listen to the podcast and send me an email and say, well, why were you laughing? And it's like, because actually that's what we do. That's absolutely how we release the emotions that are around those really, really dark, insufferable things.
It's lovely, Woon, when you describe your first true moral find, that it was an expression of joy, that it was, I mean, that's not humor necessarily, but that it was a real happiness, and how, breaking through that was for you.
So definitely finding joy and finding pleasure is one connection between mushrooms and mourning, and the other is purpose, right? Giving a sense of direction. So in this, when identity is in flux and you are in this soup of chaos, I like that.
It's lovely.
Yes, you need to find your mushroom, and I suppose, I mean, from my little example, if something sparks joy in you, that is the direction you might want to consider, and then it might, and that might give you purpose, which pleasure and purpose is going to take you out of this soup, So that's a quick answer to your American interviewers. Yeah.
But I think people often feel really guilty about seeking those moments of pleasure and joy.
It's true.
It's almost like they don't have permission. They don't feel like they've got permission to enjoy themselves.
Because when you're grieving, you are supposed to be sad and in that space and have no energy and nothing. But there might be something that gives you pleasure, and you should allow yourself to.
And it just turns out that grief is a more varied and interesting space than just monotone sadness. That's not what grief actually is. And it's, I think, leaning towards the things that please you is always the answer to everything.
So we've reached a moment when I can open up to any questions. Si vous avez des questions en français, je vais les poser en anglais pour les deux. Feel free. I can continue as well. See any hands raised?
This is the bit where everyone always looks really awkward and starts shuffling.
Oh, there's going to be a mic coming for you.
Yeah, I had a question about the mushroom, the mycology. When you're searching for them, I mean, is this like a culinary thing as well? I mean, did you also learn to cook the mushrooms you're finding, or is it more about like a bird watching kind of thing, or is it both, if you know what I mean?
The question was, I'll just repeat quickly, I'm not sure everyone heard, was the mushroom hunting, was it also a culinary experience or just a forest experience?
Well, for me, I came to mushrooms because of food, because of mushrooms as food, right? Because I like eating mushrooms, and I think a lot of people start mushrooming because of that. However, even though I did, learn a huge many new recipes and what to do with, and I have a whole chapter with mushroom recipes, right?
Very good looking pate, I thought.
I was thinking the pate and the bacon, mushroom bacon, mushroom pate.
There's several things for you to try there. When people develop this interest, you discover that that there's a lot more to mushrooms. And in the Norwegian Mushrooming Society, anyway, you would have people who are interested in using mushrooms as dyes, to color their wool for knitting and things like that. And you have people who suddenly start, they get a microscope and they never get out of the room anymore, because the house anymore, because they're just there, microscoping their mushrooms. So there's so many directions it can take you. And definitely, the knowledge of mushrooms, identifying the mushrooms, that's like number one for many people. Yeah.
I was fascinated, just briefly, you gave us an overview of sort of mushroom culture in Norway and how different it is. I mean, culturally, mushrooms are different in every country. That in Norway, in fact, it was an elite who had originally eaten mushrooms, and other people would not go for mushrooms at all.
That's true. So I discovered, doing research for the book that, during the Second World War, when food was short, a lot of people, they see their animals eating mushrooms, but they themselves would not eat mushrooms because this is like fodder for animals, right? And it was the more sophisticated Norwegians who had gone abroad and learned about, mushrooms being something that, you could eat in a nice fancy restaurant, who brought this knowledge and activity back to Norway. Yeah.
It's very interesting how different that was. Any other questions? More questions? Hands. A quiet group. Yes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Merci d'abord pour cette très intéressante conversation. Je suis désolée, je n'ai pas lu vos livres pour l'instant. Mais ce qui m'a beaucoup intéressée dans ce que vous avez dit, c'est le sentiment du temps dans le deuil ou les époques difficiles. C'est la durée très différente que prend le temps et auquel c'est vrai que la société, en tout cas la société occidentale dans laquelle nous vivons, ne nous habitue pas du tout, et combien il est difficile de passer de ce temps lent et difficile, lorsqu'on travaille encore, même lorsqu'on traverse ces périodes, de retourner dans le temps rapide qu'exige en fait la société dans laquelle nous vivons. Et je voulais savoir si vous aviez expérimenté ces différences de temps et cette difficulté de passer de l'un à l'autre.
She's talking about how time is experienced when you're grieving or in a fallow period, and how it can be experienced in different ways, and how difficult it can be to return to a normal, sort of fast-paced time of life, and how you experienced that or worked through it in your different experiences.
Yeah, I mean, often I think when you're returning, it's almost like you're stepping onto a travelator. The world is moving at a different speed to the one you are, and it's quite affronting at first. I mean, I think we've all experienced that recently, haven't we? Kind of going back into the world and being in places where people are and where there's noise and bustle, and actually, having your diary full again. Like, all of those things have been quite strange and unnerving in a way that is unexpected. I think we were all thinking, this is going to be great, and then there's been a bit of a step back. And I talk about it in Wintering, that actually you have to almost consciously thaw after a winter, that you need to think about how you gradually make your way back into the world rather than just jumping back in, because actually I think that's really harmful. I think it can rebound on you. But that's not a simple question for any of us, because that's like an economic question. It's a social question about how we allow people to come back. I mean, I didn't write about it in the book, but certainly after I'd been very sick and I had like a month left to work at my job, I remember going back in and I still couldn't, I couldn't stand up straight. I was still in loads of pain. I'd lost loads of weight. I felt really physically weak. I was really tired. And I remember thinking, there's no sort of set pathway for me to get back into this working day. It was all or nothing. And that was impossible. And I got halfway through my first day and my boss sent me home. She was like, "You do not look okay. You are not okay. You shouldn't be back." But there was, of course, all this pressure, because actually, I was signed off sick, sure, but that's for a limited period of time before you start losing your wages. And it's not a simple matter, and we shouldn't talk about it as it is. And having spent the last 2 years talking to American audiences about this, they have none of the stuff that we rely on. And that's a huge problem because it means they can either work or they are very, very sick indeed. And I think it's something we genuinely need to start addressing about how people ramp back into work and maybe sometimes ramp down from their commitments too. These are not steps, they're ramps.
Woon, did you feel that pressure as well to be back to normal life?
Well, definitely I did, and I can echo everything you have just said, but I was just thinking, whilst I was grieving, time becomes a dimension which sort of moves in ways that you're not used to, and it moves on without you, and it moves fast, it moves slow, so it was something that I had problems relating to. So I had a different experience of time, definitely, whilst I was grieving, yeah. And without having, words or ways to relate to it. So that was also a new experience in a way, yeah.
Do we have time for one more question?
There's one in the back.
Is there one in the... Yes, please.
Yes. I noticed that you you mentioned that to process your grief, you didn't approach anything related to religion. So, meaning that I wanted to understand if it's maybe a signal that you perceive that standard religion, is not giving any more guidance or answers on this kind of grief, or it's just your personal approach and your beliefs, if you can comment.
Yes, thank you. I'm not a very, I don't belong to any organized religion, but when I was grieving, I wished I did, because I thought at least, they might have an answer. That was the only time I felt envious in a way of someone who is very religious, because maybe when you're experiencing something that is totally senseless and without meaning and you are lost, that there's something somewhere out there that can show you the way. But I didn't have that privilege, and that was maybe the only time in my life when I was envious of religious people, because I thought maybe they had an answer that what I was searching for. Yeah.
Thank you. If there's any more, I think we can do one more. Okay, then. Was that a finger? No.
There's a twitch.
Yes. A finger.
Thank you. Katherine, when through your journey with Wintering and the book and the podcast and all the people that you've spoken to internationally about the concept, you must have heard so many different approaches to the concept of Wintering that you put forward. And the way that it happened for you was there was a moment, there was an event that forced you into that space. Have you heard lots of stories from people where they've consciously decided to enter a Wintering phase?
Yes, it's interesting. I think very few stories where people have consciously decided to enter that space, actually, and I'd kind of love to see more of that, but I think, again, it's about kind of cultural permission, isn't it? But there seems to be people who can do that within a religious tradition, so people who are Buddhists, for example, quite commonly go into these retreat periods. And I do know some Catholics that actually enter monasteries or convents for a period. So I've heard about that, but actually surprisingly little. One thing I have noticed is that chronic illness sufferers often reach a decision point that's very conscious about the moment that they decide that they need to acknowledge how sick they are. There's a long time when they're kind of pushing it back, and then there's a kind of point of surrender and change. but I think I'm most interested in how few people do actually consciously go in.
Actively.
And how often there's just this big fight up front before it takes you instead. You have no choice, yeah. And I would love to make a way for us to say, I'm going into this now. This is my retreat time. That's an interesting project, actually.
Thank you. So I would like to remind everyone that there will be a signing. The books are available in French and English. And please join me in giving a huge thank you to Katherine May and Litt Woon.
Thank you.